As you can tell, I'm Helen. That's James over there, just in case you were confused. I am wearing a tie, so I'm not an architect. I am part of the Supply Chain School. Show of hands, who's heard of the Supply Chain Sustainability School? I'm going to go home now then, there's no point me talking about it. Good, that's great. So I am sector manager within the Supply Chain School. I am also a consultant for Action Sustainability, where James will be talking about later, who run the school on behalf of the construction industry. I've been in procurement for 23 years. 20 of those are in construction, so I'm still a baby, really, in comparison with lots of people. But very, very passionate about the power of supply chains and actually the importance of actually just generally good procurement, which we don't see as often as we should do in construction, unfortunately. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about now is how we've used the power of the school to start providing one voice to the supply chain and all those poor so-and-sos that you lot hit really hard with all those terms and conditions and requirements, the poor little SMEs as they get down the supply chain, and what the heck can they do to help you and help themselves in dealing with these issues. So part of what we're going to talk about is the school. I'm going to go through this quickly because you pretty much all know it. But if you didn't know it, it is free, a very rare thing in the construction industry. We don't make suppliers pay. Our partners pay for that prerogative. It's an online system, it's voluntary, so again, it's not tied into any sort of pre-qualifications. And what it's designed to do is increase capability and understanding around sustainability in general. So we have a range of topics, about 10 headline topics, ranging from the environmental, from the social, and the economic, challenging our supply chain to really think about how they impact on construction supply chains and how they can deliver sustainable outcomes. Within that, they can assess their competency, they can actually do reassessments, and it's about understanding their own knowledge, their own information in this area. It provides them with a 10-point action plan, so when you go in, you understand what you do, what you don't know, what you should know. It gives you a 10-point plan. You can go through a load of resources, of some of which I'll go through from the modern slavery perspective. And I think at the moment the current rating is about 2,000 resources that we have available through the school. And as a writer of some of them, it keeps us very busy trying to keep those all up to date. But the beauty of the resources is it's not a Google for sustainability. We have people who actually contribute resources, and it's designed to push construction supply chains in terms of best practice in this area. It also allows organisations to develop at their own pace. So we have some people who come into the school, are inspirational, run at 90 miles an hour and suddenly are doing all things all over the place because they're inspired. We have some that are a little bit slower to drink the water, come up and think about it, put their foot in, and then move at the pace that suits them. The other thing we do is run engagement events. So we run workshops, supplier days. I was actually running a supplier day on modern slavery in the facilities management industry about 3 weeks ago. And I was in Wales 2 weeks ago for the launch of the ethical procurement standard within Wales and how modern slavery is affected within that. So we get involved in various different supply chain events to support. And it's also about getting the big guys. So the construction school is actually paid for by 64 partners. It changes every day, so you'll have to bear with me. We had 6 when we originally started 5 years ago. So as you can see, it's grown tenfold over 5 years. The idea is that the big boys, all the likes of the Skanskas, the Carillions, the Balfours, we now have clients like HS2, Heathrow, National Grid. We have actually first-tier suppliers now like Fortel and VGC who are providing labour. So we're starting to get the value chain to come together to collaborate. And obviously our members benefit from that because we're starting to see better ways of supply chains collaborating, which was a really strong message so far today. The other thing then we have is 10,000 organisations within our portal. So we have 10,000 individual organisations that are using the resources. Each of those has a variety of members, so we have about 20,000 people accessing our resources at any one time, ranging from e-learning modules up to workshops. And our sectors include FM, homes, construction, infrastructure, and off-site and DFMA, soon to be lean construction, which we're adding to the field. And Wales and Scotland have their own sector, but that is just a geographical thing. It's not that they're any different, it's just that they've got their own challenges. So why is modern slavery, and what have we done within the school on modern slavery? Well, I said I'm a procurement professional, but over the last few years, I've become incredibly passionate about how we can use procurement, particularly in supply chains, to think about combating modern slavery. And all of that was because one day I got a phone call saying, Helen, we've got this special interest group. We need to get some of the construction companies together to respond to this thing that's coming out called the Modern Slavery Act. We have no idea what it is, what the implications are, and how the hell the supply chain is going to respond to it. Would you mind just putting them all in a room and having a conversation about what this looks like? So we did. 6 months later, we ended up with quite a few resources and a lot of sore heads in terms of how we were going to be able to respond. What we did was we put together what we call a special interest group, and within there we had principal contractors like Skanska, we had Interserve, Balfour Beatty, we had Nottingham University, Helen University, who also provided input in terms of from an academic perspective. And the idea was that we were looking to produce a one-voice material. One thing that the construction industry is really doing is saying the same thing 20 million different times. And as you disseminate that down the supply chain, funnily enough, suppliers get a bit confused. So the idea of the special interest group was to produce materials that could be standardized and used within the industry and provide practical tips. We've heard today the big issues about a lot of the global concerns that are out there. But when we get into the supply chain and we start talking to a lot of our members, 70% of who are SMEs, they go, we know it's terrible, we know we want to do something, we have just no idea what the hell it is. So a lot of the resources that we produced are trying to target these guys to start thinking about how they can resilient their own organisation, but also then respond to their clients' requirements, because questions will start coming through the procurement process to be able to deal with that. So the special interest group ran for 6 months. We produced a series of materials. So, as in all the training materials ever done, is there's lots of e-learning modules, and the beauty of this is it's free. So all of these resources are available to anyone who wants to go into the school. We have 3 e-learning modules, ranging from a very quick 15-minute what is modern slavery, what is the Act, through to a 45-minute e-learning module, which actually takes more of that holistic view and delves into things like supply chain mapping, of which my colleague James is going to go more into later on. But then we also produced a series of documents, again, trying to get people to think about some practicalities. So there was summary advice in terms of the Modern Slavery Act, what it meant, tips for businesses in terms of things they should think about and consider. We also had some guidance, interestingly, on the transparency guidance that came out from government. And it was interesting hearing about, the guidance is there, the information is there in terms of what goes into your statement, and the guidance in terms of the sort of key areas that you need to focus on. And we put some summary documentation together. One of the other summary documents that we did, and again, it's a very big driver for us at the moment, is to start widening the conversation away from just modern slavery. The school has actually done a lot of work in terms of increasing the social agenda around sustainability within the construction industry. One of the things that we're seeing is that if organisations are thinking about immigration, if they're thinking about right-to-work checks, there's links in with things like modern slavery. The bribery and corruption, there's links in with modern slavery. If you're paying people decent money, if you're actually treating them properly and giving them working conditions and have a good ethical approach to this, you have a link into modern slavery and you have a link into being able to combat it. So a lot of the dialogue that we're starting now within the school is about pushing it further than just modern slavery and thinking about an ethical approach to the way that you do business. The other thing is, because I'm procurement, and I know how poor buyers get a little bit bogged down with what's my contract term and how do I respond to this stuff, is we put procurement guidance out there. So we literally ran through a very good procurement process and said these are the gateways that you can actually inject requirements around modern slavery, and it isn't just, I'm going to put a contract clause in and I'm going to audit you, which is historically what we like to do in procurement, but it is more about that collaboration piece. So a procurement guide was put together. And then finally, because we are talking to construction people, we have to make the message relevant to them. There is a massive resource, and if you look at Stronger Together's resources, there's some brilliant resources in there. But slowly over time, we've started to build materials that are talking to construction people in a language they understand. We have a program within the school called Fairness, Inclusion and Respect, which is challenging the culture on sites in terms of how builders behave, whether they're female or male, how we deal with the ethnic diversity issues. And actually things like our toolbox talk are designed to get these guys to notice each other, to look for signs, to actually not just think all I've got to do is check a passport, all I've got to do is check visas. Actually pay attention and give some consideration to the people that you're working with. It was interesting, I was working, when the Act first came out, I come from Stafford in the Midlands, hence I haven't got quite a posh accent, as you can tell. And I was going to an event which was run by the local police, and in Staffordshire is a very big agricultural centre. And we were talking about the sorts of challenges that you need to do, and it's actually challenging a lot of these people to think about the softer side of how we do our business. There was a brilliant presentation from an organisation called Stop the Traffic, who I recommend you go and talk to. The lady was inspirational, and she was talking about a campaign that she was running for taxi drivers. And at the time, I hadn't passed my test, so I was getting a taxi home. And in the taxi, there was a sticker, a Stop the Traffic sticker. He'd been on the training campaign. And he was one of my regular taxi drivers, so I was having a discussion with him, pointed it out. And he went, "Oh yeah, I used to work for a construction company." He told me who it was. I shall not mention them. He says, and we used to have this bloke. He says, "I thought he loved Arsenal. He came onto site every day wearing the same Arsenal shirt, getting dirtier and dirtier and tired and tighter, never spoke to anyone. Actually, he went home at the end of the night. We don't actually know how we got home. We never circulated. Now I've been on that training, actually thinking about it, he may have been a bit exploited. I've seen those signs now. I understand what those signs are. So it's challenging people to look over and above a tick box and start to get to know the people that we work with. We mentioned the organisational checklist. It is a bit of a tick box. It is not designed to be a tick box. It's designed to get people thinking and to discuss that conversation. This is a cultural issue. Elaine's going to talk to you later on about the journey that Marshalls have done. We've had presentations in the school from Marks and Spencer's. It's taken them about 15 years. I remember going to a responsible sourcing conference from B&Q. It took them 20 years to do things like the FSC. It's a long journey. So actually things like the organisational checklists are frameworks to allow people to think about the direction that they're going in, not designed to say, have policy, tick, have training, tick. It's a direction to go rather than just do these things and suddenly you will be slavery free. So finally, before I hand over to James, who's going to give you an overview in terms of the mapping we then went on to, we had a little bit of think within the school. And actually, Aima and Tim have alluded to this in terms of the huge challenge in our industry is to start thinking about combating a huge range of sustainability issues. I've been dealing with sustainability as a subject matter for about 10 or 11 years. And when I first started, I used to get all the conversations about tree hugging and polar bears and all the sorts of things that's what sustainability was all about. Luckily for us, we now have a much more educated clientele within the construction industry, and we are aware it's not just climate change. That is an issue, but it's a wide range of complex social, environmental, and economic issues. So within procurement and challenging our procurement people on a day-to-day basis to think about not just buying best value, but also using the right suppliers and collaborating with them, there's actually a framework out there, and Tim's alluded to it in terms of 2400. And if you look at the certain elements of embedding really good sustainable procurement, this applies to modern slavery. It applies to any other issue that you've got within sustainability. If you look at the transparency requirements that the government is looking for, most of the areas that you should be thinking about to embed sustainable considerations in your organisation are covered within that framework. So the fundamentals are, do you know why you're doing this? We see a huge difference in terms of people's response to this. People are aware of the co-op response. Co-op will actually help the victims, give them a home, give them a job. Their drivers are very strong, very reputational, very brand orientated. So the idea is understanding how far you want to go and making sure you have all those in place. Then your policy and strategy. We actually recommend that organisations don't just do, I've got a modern slavery statement or a policy. Actually, what you should be doing is taking this opportunity to look at your whole approach to the way that you deal with ethical labour standards, with the way that you manage your supply chain. So modern slavery is an important issue that you need to be thinking about, but it will also go hand in hand with the amount you pay people, the sort of working hours and conditions that you do. They're all interrelated. Bringing that into your goals, aligning it with your business, making it one of your sustainability commitments. And then the enablers piece. We've talked a lot about the enablers piece. Training people is one. Raising awareness is another. I actually did an event for CIOB in London where I trained some of their members, which was kind of interesting because I had a 6-foot-tall, 6-foot-wide Hungarian builder come up to me at the end of it and give me a big hug and then say, I've seen all these things happening on site, what do I do? which point I had to put him in whistleblowing type scenarios. But it is about, even if you're talking to the people who are out on site every day, making them aware of what those issues are and giving them that option and helping them and supporting them. Governing it, engaging stakeholders. Again, the recommendations we give out to organisations is you are not there to be the victim support. You can find the victims, you can help, but organisations like GLAA, the police, they're trained to deal with the victims. It was interesting, one of the stats that I gave out, one of the stats that was given out at this police conference I went to, said that they actually saved a Vietnamese boy from a cannabis farm, and they stuck him in Wales for the 45-day period that they have to put him in safeguarding. And every day in that 45 days, he tried to escape because he didn't see himself as a victim. He thought it was the way he was always brought up. So actually, you will not be trained as construction professionals to deal with this issue. You need to co-op with people like the GLA, like the police, like the Samaritans, who are all trained to help the victims. And then finally, the easy bit, which we're going to hand over to James for, the procurement process. We've got loads of issues in our supply chain. In construction, it's not just on our sites. In construction, we have supply chains that are global, and we need to start taking responsibility the way other sectors have done to start thinking about how we do that. So that's a nice lead in now to James, who's going to talk about the way the school did it in terms of the mapping to help with the construction industry.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just to continue the tie theme, I'm an environmental chemist by training, and ties and chemistry never mix because they're flammable and they soak up solvent, so I never wear a tie. I've learned through experience. Okay, so that was a great scene setting for what's been going on. One of the other things that the school recognised was, well, what are some of the implementable actions we can actually do about this? So all the training, all the advice, all the checklists, great source of materials. One of those things that comes out in the guidance around the Modern Slavery Act is identifying your risks, putting in due diligence, putting in training, putting in some of the metrics and KPIs to measure your performance. So how do you do that? The sharp end of it is the procurement guys who are actually going out and engaging with their supply chain on a regular basis. So we thought, do we need to do something around supply chain mapping? It's nothing new. It's been out there for some time. There's lots of software available as well if you want to go and buy your own thing. But we thought, well, what are the practicalities of it within the construction and built environment sectors? So we convened a group, another special interest group, but following on and building on the modern slavery work that Helen has alluded to. And we started off by saying, well, what do we want to get out of supply chain mapping? What do we want to talk about? And effectively, we wanted a tool and a visual representation to help procurement and buying communities and other people involved in the process to identify where risks might lie. First of all, where are our supply chains and where might the risks lie? The issue is often that you speak to procurement and buyers, and they'll know their first-tier suppliers and maybe their second, but then it gets hazy and a lot more vague as you go further and further. And it depends on the product as well. But having that transparency was key to helping that decision process. So what we've been talking about in this situation is the tools to help you make that decision. It's not a be-all and end-all. It's not a panacea or a silver bullet. It's another tool in your toolbox to help you. So what was our approach and what was the benefit of doing supply chain mapping? We were conscious that we didn't want to just go out and say, well, the supply comes from here to here to here to here, and that's it. Great, we know where it is. But to understand what the risks are inherently within that. So we were talking in the language of layers. So understanding what the product goes through or the service goes through in its processes from start to end, where that might happen, what the activities are that that product undergoes, and importantly, what the inherent risks are around that. You'll see, and if you search online, there's many examples of supply chain mapping out there. The one on the left is Marks and Spencer's. So if you're really interested where your cotton shirt comes from and it happens to be Bangladesh, you can find out where it is, for example. Nike do the same, Debenhams. The one on the right, which unfortunately is in black, stupidly, is from Kering, who own Puma. But there's lots of them out there. This is a good external-facing tool for consumers. What we're talking about here, though, is more of an internal tool to help that decision-making process. So what did we actually do? Well, we convened a group. We got various interested partners and other people involved in the school to come together on several occasions. Helen's already alluded to the fact that Marks and Spencer's gave us their overview on how long it's taken them and how much work they still have to do, to set up a process of investigating, doing a trial basically. What does it take to do supply chain mapping for the construction sector? We chose the 4 products up there. We thought they would be representative across the built environment, so not just construction, not just FM, something that everyone can relate to. relatively easy products, you'd have thought as well, to kind of do that investigation. And then we went out and did some mapping, essentially, and started speaking to people. The key thing that came out of this for us was understanding where a supplier might be sounds very simple. The questions we went out with were, who are your suppliers, where are they, and what activity do they do? We were very clear to say, we're not asking you about your revenue, your turnover, your margins, your profit, your pricing, none of that. We'll keep that out of it. And still, there's a lot of resistance, as you'd understand, because it's commercial confidentiality, people concerned about losing business, and so on. So there's definitely hearts and minds in this. The mechanics of it are fairly straightforward, but the reality of getting people to understand it it's a relationship building thing. But we got there, otherwise I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. Sorry, that slide has got a little bit screwed up. I'm sure you can guess what those things say. Essentially, we'd map out what a product might go through. This is a fairly standard kind of life cycle approach. You dig something up, you process it, you turn it into a product or a component, you stick it together, you put it in a ship, and you ship it. So we started with that, effectively that basic approach to kinds of products, but services as well. We shouldn't ignore the labour aspect of this. But understanding that the risk of modern slavery can exist up and down the supply chain at various different stages. So that was the key first stage. And then we engaged directly with the partners of the supply chain school to engage with their suppliers. And there was lots of willingness and enthusiasm, and we got a really good response, actually. I'm going to show you a few examples of what we got back, just to demonstrate the kinds of information that come out, but importantly, what you can do with that information and how useful it is. So this one is a high-vis vest, which we've all probably got in the boot of our car somewhere. You'd think it's a relatively simple product, but when you actually get into it, there's polycotton, there's a reflective stripe, there's some Velcro or some press studs, there's some binding, which is the bit that goes around the edges. There might be a badge on it as well. There's various components. This is still a simple product. We're not talking HVAC equipment here by any means. But you can see how complex that supply chain is. Apologies if you can't read it, but essentially, countries include India for the cotton, China for the press studs, the USA for the reflective tape, China again for the binding, and that's before you even kind of put it all together. So this was the second stage of overlaying the location and the activity being undertaken to make those products. And we heard from one of the earlier speakers that there's those checklists that you need to go through to understand, well, where is the risk? And one of them is the activity that's being undertaken. Is it low value? Is it low paid, low skilled? Those kinds of issues. This will help you get that picture if you're interacting with your PPE supplier. The next stage is then to think about, well, what's the risk of modern slavery for this supply chain? And using publicly available information, you can simply plot where do you think there's a higher risk. Now, admittedly, this is at country level, so you have to take it with a pinch of salt, but it's information, it's tools to help you think about your decision-making process, who you need to interact with, who potentially you might want to audit, that bogey word of audit. Audit does still have value in certain places. You might want to go out and speak to some of your suppliers. And what's interesting is just getting an idea of where all your stuff comes from. So for that particular high-vis vest, I've mentioned India and China. It all comes to Europe in its various component form, and then goes to Morocco for being put together before it comes back to the UK for being used, which is balmy just for food miles, let alone modern slavery. Cotton miles. Who would have thought about Morocco in terms of modern slavery? We always think of China, we always think of India, Bangladesh, those kinds of places. A lot of the people around the room for our special interest group didn't even consider North Africa in terms of what we're talking about, but this one cropped up. That's not, let's not forget the UK. We've talked about that a lot this morning as well. That can still, still happen here as well. But this is the kind of end tool that would be useful for a category manager thinking about the risks inherent with the supply of certain products. The reality of mapping this one product is that you can't do it for every product. This is one particular high-vis vest. You can get it in a different color, a different size, with sleeves, without sleeves, with a badge, without a badge, numerous combinations. So there's just not a practical reality to map every single supply chain. But using this as a tool to understand the likelihood or the kind of picture that's out there for those kind of categories is a useful piece of research. And indeed, that's the direction that the supply chain school is going in, is taking more of a category-based approach. So that's useful for the procurement manager. Because we had great interest, we said, yes, bring it on. Let's look at as many of these as possible. We looked at a different high-vis vest. As you can see, it's a different high-vis vest. But this one was entirely different. This one all came from China, if I remember rightly. And we had a very helpful supplier of PPE who was happening to go out to do some audits in China during the process that we were undertaking. And he helpfully told us exactly where these things come from. Didn't give us the name of the supplier because of confidentiality reasons, but you're homing in on the locations. And he'll be able to tell us that you can go to one of these provinces in China, and I'm sure many of you know this already, and there'll be dozens and hundreds of factories knocking out the same bits. And finding your particular factory, and then it might shift to another one, that's the reality and the problem of this. But you can drill down and understand, well, what are the risks here, and who do we need to focus on? Because there's only a limited amount of time and budget to really investigate what we need to do. It's a risk process, and that ties in entirely with the ISO 2400 procurement standard. So, yeah. Not all high-vis vest jackets are the same if we're getting a bit Orwellian. We looked at plastic bags, extremely simple product, very simple, but important to the FM industry. This one, just to show you, is complicated by the fact that the basic raw material can come from the UK, Germany, Vietnam, or China. It's just a plastic bag. And yet you're thinking, oh, crikey, have I got to think about that as well? But going through this process can help you think about where to focus those risks and what the likelihood of reputational impact and actual direct impact on your business is. Probably not for plastic bags, but you get the idea. And we did it for a couple of other products, as I say, as well, to demonstrate the process. So the outcome, like the resources that Helen alluded to, there's some resources on the Supply Chain School, free to access, on understanding the reality of supply chain mapping, how to go about it, some of the results that we got as well. What's important to say is that this takes time. It's a relatively simple process, but it takes a lot of time, and it's the relationship building that I was talking about earlier. A good example of how it can go wrong is when I spoke to one of the partners who'd spoken to suppliers on our behalf because they had the relationship, and we said those three very simple questions. Who are your suppliers, where are they, and what do they do? What came back to me was an ISO 14001 certificate. Superb. I don't care. I want to know where you are and what you're doing. So getting the message right and getting people to understand it is really key to this, to help that decision-making process. And that's it. Thank you.